I do want to shift gears as well as we're getting more news about a New Hampshire primary. President Biden not going to be on the ballot there. Some controversy with the Democrats in their party, but also in Colorado as a judge is hearing closing arguments about whether Trump will be on the ballot there. We want to bring in right now friend of the program, Neama Rahmani. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. And this is a very interesting case, closing arguments in Colorado around the January 6th insurrection, whether Trump will be on the case. You've been following this. What's the latest and what can we make of the closing arguments today?
Well, we heard closing arguments today, and Judge Wallace is going to have to make a decision. And like you said, Andy, this is a constitutional scholar's dream, a historian. You're going back to a 19th century Civil War amendment that prohibits anyone who engages in an insurrection from holding public office. So really the question is, did Donald Trump engage in an insurrection up into and including January 6th? And if so, can he be excluded from the ballot in Colorado? And we're seeing lawsuits like this in other states as well, but they've failed, including Minnesota and Michigan.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because, like you mentioned, it goes back 150 or so years, only a handful of times. And in so many court cases, they rely on precedent, but there's really not a ton of precedent here. Does that maybe lean it in favor of the former president, Donald Trump?
I think so, Andy. I think he really has the upper hand here, and for so many reasons. One, we're really talking about uncharted legal waters. I mean, never has modern history a candidate been excluded for public office on this basis. And frankly, he's got a lot of potential legal arguments. And as long as one of these stick, he's going to win. The simplest one, of course, is that he didn't engage in an insurrection. He hasn't been charged. He's dealing with indictments and charges in 4 different states, but none of them have charged him with sedition or insurrection. And in addition, there's this question of standing. Do the folks who are bringing these types of claims actually have a legal basis to do so? Are they actually the aggrieved party? And in addition, there's arguments like this is just a political question. That's something that the Michigan courts hung their hat on. They said, listen, this is something that Congress needs to deal with. And although Donald Trump was impeached, he wasn't convicted in Congress. And of course, there's the argument that it prevents someone from holding public office, but not running for office. And that's something the Minnesota courts look to. They said, listen, this is just a primary, and we're not able to decide who can run in a primary. Maybe talk to us during the general election or after if you think that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment applies.
Yeah, and obviously you mentioned just different states dealing with this, Minnesota, Michigan, now Colorado, potentially in favor there of Trump. We'll see what comes of this today. But when you think about this, what happened on January 6th happened in Washington, D.C., and now this is in Colorado as well. Maybe what are the jurisdictions? Because you mentioned Michigan, you mentioned Minnesota and Colorado. It feels like this is a little bit out of their ballpark. Is that wrong to say?
Potentially, Colorado's probably the best jurisdictions for those trying to keep Trump off the ballot. And this is what Colorado actually requires the Secretary of State to reject people that are constitutionally not qualified to be on the ballot. There's this affirmative duty, and that's something that we've seen. The Michigan courts, for instance, said, listen, there's no affirmative duty or obligation for the state to decide who's on a primary ballot. But Colorado, the way the law is written there, actually does impose this obligation on the Secretary of State. Now, the Secretary of State, there's a Democrat, hasn't really taken a position one way or the other, but the law, at least as written in Colorado, is a little bit more favorable to those that are pushing forward this argument.
That is a very interesting case. And I do want to come back to the Constitution because obviously Trump has been indicted in several different states, of course, in D.C. on potentially inciting this as conspiracy to as well, but also there might be a First Amendment thing that he did say these things, but he didn't really tell them to do what they did. Is that maybe a potential defense for Trump, that he did say these things, but he didn't intend for this to happen? It wasn't his words that led to this.
Yes, and that's something that Trump's lawyers have been discussing in every single case where this argument's been brought is, listen, Trump obviously is a candidate. He has a freedom of speech, and when he said fight like hell and, all the words that he used, it didn't rise to the level of actually engaging in insurrection. Trump, of course, personally didn't storm the Capitol building or, ask his loyal followers to overthrow the government. So just from a factual basis as well, it's a tough argument. And frankly, Andy, that's why none of the prosecutors, many of whom wanted to go after Donald Trump, they didn't charge him with insurrection. It's going to be difficult to prove in a criminal court as well as in the 14th Amendment Section 3 context here.
Yeah, and I want to play maybe devil's advocate here because Trump has kind of won in all of these different states, potentially again in Colorado. But let's say he doesn't win. Let's say they keep him off the ballot. Colorado is a pretty big battleground state. Maybe what does that do for the election? How much may that impact his presidential nomination? Is that something that could keep him out of the White House?
Well, it could. Obviously, if the state judge there excludes Trump, we're going to see a pretty quick appeal to the Colorado Supreme Court. And almost certainly this is going to end up in the U.S. Supreme Court if there's actually a judge that keeps Trump off the ballot. But Andy, you raised a good point. I mean, a significant percentage of the American people support Donald Trump, whether it's 40, 50%, maybe even more. And if a judge excludes him from the ballot, I mean, setting aside the law, there's going to be some millions, tens, maybe hundreds of millions of Americans that are pretty upset. So there's some public policy considerations at play here. Are we really, using our legal system, our court system to keep a candidate from a major political party off the ballot? That's something to be concerned about as well.
Yeah, that would certainly, like we said, set some precedent potentially moving forward, not something that maybe either party wants. All right, Neama, Rahmani, thank you so much for breaking it all down. Of course, we continue to talk about Trump in various different cases, but this one taking place in Colorado. Thanks again for providing so much insight.
Thanks for having me, Andy.
All right, thank you.